Close your eyes and imagine standing at the edge of history itself, peering into the void where entire civilizations once thrived. Tonight, we're going to explore something that should keep historians awake at night, yet somehow makes the perfect companion for those drifting into sleep. We're talking about the missing pieces of our human story, the blank pages where millions of lives simply vanished from the record. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly what I hoped for. Maybe hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing messages from Tokyo at sunrise and Toronto at midnight, all of us connected by the same ancient mysteries. There's something deeply peaceful about contemplating the unknown. Unlike the chaos of today's news cycle, these puzzles have waited thousands of years. They'll wait another night. There's no rush, no pressure, just the quiet comfort of knowing that history is far stranger than anyone admits. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's walk together through the forgotten centuries, the lost decades, the missing millennia where human civilization flickered and sometimes went completely dark. The world as we understand it is supposed to follow a simple pattern. Humans learn to farm. They build villages. Villages become cities. Cities spawn empires. Knowledge accumulates steadily, generation after generation, like sediment slowly forming rock. We imagine history as a straight line pointing upward toward progress. But that's not what the evidence shows. When you actually examine the archaeological record, really dig into what we can prove versus what we assume, you find something unsettling. There are holes everywhere. Not small gaps where we're missing a few details, but enormous chasms where entire societies simply cease to exist in any meaningful way. We're talking about kingdoms that ruled for centuries, then vanished so completely that even their names were forgotten. Technologies that took generations to perfect, then disappeared as if they'd never existed. Writing systems that recorded the daily lives of millions, then fell silent for hundreds of years. These aren't just missing footnotes in history textbooks. These are entire chapters that have been torn out, whole epochs where we genuinely don't know what happened to vast populations of human beings. Consider this: around 1200 years before the Common Era, the Eastern Mediterranean was the most advanced, interconnected region on Earth. Multiple powerful kingdoms traded across thousands of miles. They had professional armies, sophisticated writing systems, complex diplomacy. Cities housed tens of thousands of people with running water and multi-story buildings. Then, in less than a century, almost all of it collapsed. Not declined gradually, but collapsed suddenly and catastrophically. Cities burned. Trade networks shattered. Writing disappeared. The archaeological evidence shows destruction layer after destruction layer across dozens of major sites, all concentrated in just a few decades. For the next 400 years, the historical record goes almost completely dark. Population levels plummeted. People forgot how to write. Monumental architecture stopped. The sophisticated international world that had connected 3 continents was replaced by isolated villages that barely knew what existed beyond the nearest valley. What caused this? We genuinely don't know. Was it climate change? Invading sea peoples? Systems collapse? All of the above? The very people who could have told us what happened lost the ability to write down their experiences. The catastrophe destroyed not just the civilizations themselves, but the records of what went wrong. This is just one example. History is filled with these voids, these periods where the lights simply went out and stayed out for generations. Or consider Europe after Rome fell. The greatest empire the Western world had ever seen didn't just decline, it fragmented so completely that within a few generations, people were living in the ruins of their ancestors' buildings with no idea how those structures had been constructed. The roads were still there, stretching across the continent like a vast stone web. The aqueducts still stood. The libraries still held thousands of scrolls. Everything was physically present except the knowledge of how to maintain it, how to use it, how to continue what Rome had built. Within 200 years, most major European cities had lost 80 to 90% of their population. Literacy nearly vanished. Technical knowledge of all kinds simply evaporated. How to build stone bridges, how to make concrete, how to construct multi-story buildings, all documented in Roman manuals that nobody could read anymore. The period we call the Dark Ages wasn't dark because nothing was happening. It was dark because we can barely see into it. The written record doesn't just decline, it nearly disappears. In some regions, we go from hundreds of documents per decade to maybe 1 or 2 per century. We're not looking at a period of simple decline. We're looking at a period where our ability to know what was happening almost completely breaks down. Entire centuries where people lived, loved, struggled, built things, created art, told stories, and we have almost no record of any of it. The Americas present an even more tragic gap. When Europeans first arrived, they found what appeared to be a mostly empty continent. This became the dominant narrative, the New World as pristine wilderness, barely touched by human hands. But archaeology tells a completely different story. On the eve of European contact, the Americas were home to somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. That's comparable to Europe's population at the same time. These people lived in massive cities. They built monumental architecture. They created sophisticated agricultural systems. They developed complex social organizations. And then, within a century of European contact, perhaps 90% of them were gone. They didn't just die. They took their history with them. Because most relied on oral traditions rather than written records, and oral traditions require continuous transmission. Break that chain through disease, warfare, or forced displacement, and the knowledge vanishes completely. Think about Cahokia, a city near modern St. Louis that around the year 1050 housed possibly 40,000 people. That made it larger than London or Paris at the time. The people there built massive earthen pyramids, constructed a grand plaza larger than 35 football fields, created sophisticated astronomical observatories. Then around 1350, it was abandoned. Not destroyed by conquest, just emptied. By the time Europeans reached the region in the 1500s, Cahokia had been deserted for over 150 years. The native peoples living nearby had no clear memory of who had built these massive earthworks. An entire civilization, gone. Its history lost because nobody wrote it down before the knowledge keepers died. This pattern repeats across both continents. Evidence of large populations, sophisticated societies, complex cultural achievements, followed by sudden abandonment or collapse, often right before or shortly after European contact. The timing is crucial. European contact brought diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza. Diseases that spread faster than the Europeans themselves, devastating populations hundreds of miles from any European settlement. Contemporary Spanish accounts from 1540 describe densely populated regions with thriving towns. French explorers traveling the same routes 150 years later found the landscape nearly empty. The cities were gone. The people were gone. Wave after wave of epidemics tore through populations with no resistance. Communities that had existed for centuries were wiped out in a generation. And when the people died, so did their knowledge. Their history, passed down orally through generations, died with the last storytellers. We get hints of what was lost. When Europeans first reached the upper Mississippi Valley in the late 1600s, they encountered enormous earthwork complexes, mounds, and elaborate geometric patterns covering hundreds of acres. The indigenous people living nearby told them they didn't know who had built them. The knowledge was already lost. Modern technology is revealing just how much we've missed. Aerial surveys using special imaging have found evidence of massive settlements in the Amazon, where scholars long assumed only scattered tribes lived. Earthworks covering thousands of square miles. Evidence of sophisticated agricultural systems supporting large populations. Cities in the jungle that were abandoned and reclaimed by the forest before Europeans ever reached them. We have better records of ancient Rome, which existed 2,000 years ago, than we do of Cahokia, which was thriving just 600 years ago. That's not because Cahokia was less important. It's because they developed different technologies for recording information, and those technologies were vulnerable in ways that stone inscriptions weren't. Then there's the Indus Valley, and this mystery is particularly maddening. Around 3,300 years before the Common Era, while Mesopotamia and Egypt were just figuring out how to build cities, a civilization emerged in what's now Pakistan and northwestern India that was, in almost every measurable way, more advanced than both. Better urban planning. More sophisticated sanitation systems. Standardized weights and measures. Evidence of long-distance trade networks stretching from Mesopotamia to Central Asia. At its peak, the Harappan civilization covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, with a population estimated at 5 million people. They built over 1,400 settlements, including massive planned cities with populations reaching 40,000 or more. These weren't random organic settlements. They were deliberately designed with grid layouts, advanced drainage systems, public baths, and multi-story buildings. Every house in their major city was connected to a sophisticated network of covered drains running along the streets. They had bathrooms with toilets, wells for fresh water. This level of civic infrastructure suggests centralized planning and maintenance. Someone had to establish standards, enforce them, maintain the systems. But we have no idea who. And here's what makes this truly frustrating: we can't read their writing. We have over 4,000 inscribed objects, mostly small seals showing animals and sequences of symbols. The script appears on pottery, copper tablets, carved stones. But the inscriptions are incredibly short. Most contain fewer than 5 symbols. The longest known inscription has only 26 symbols. Scholars have been trying to decipher the Indus script for over a century with no success. There's no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual text providing a key. We know they had writing. We know they had things to say. But the actual content is locked away, possibly forever. Around 1900 years before the Common Era, these great cities began to decline. Not suddenly, but gradually over centuries. Building quality decreased. Urban planning became less strict. By 1300 before the Common Era, the major cities were largely deserted and the civilization as a distinct entity had essentially vanished. There's no evidence of conquest. No burned layers suggesting invasion. The climate did change, with monsoon patterns shifting and some rivers changing course. But civilizations don't usually just fade away peacefully. They transform, they migrate, they adapt. The Harappans seem to have done all these things, dispersing into smaller settlements, possibly moving eastward. But in the process, they lost whatever centralized culture had maintained their distinctive civilization. And without their writing deciphered, we may never truly understand who they were. The Vedic people who appeared later spoke an Indo-European language, completely unrelated to whatever the Harappans spoke. Their texts contain no clear memories of the great cities. No stories about abandoned urban centers. It's as if an entire civilization had been completely forgotten within a few centuries of its decline. We're left with this strange paradox: a civilization sophisticated enough to maintain urban infrastructure for 1,000 years, to standardize measurements across a vast territory, to conduct long-distance trade and create beautiful art, yet one that remains fundamentally unknowable to us. Somewhere in those undeciphered symbols are answers. Names and stories and explanations. The Harappans knew who they were. They just never imagined that one day, nobody else would. Africa presents its own tragic gaps, though for different reasons. When we discuss ancient history, we speak confidently about Roman emperors, Chinese dynasties, Persian kings. We have their words, their laws, their poetry. But ask about the kingdoms of medieval West Africa, the empires that controlled the gold trade and made European rulers envious, and suddenly the story gets vague. Ask about the people who built Great Zimbabwe, one of the most impressive stone structures in the medieval world, and we shrug. This isn't because Africa lacked sophisticated civilizations. It's because much of their history was preserved through oral tradition, elaborate systems of storytelling passed down through specialized historians. These weren't casual tales. They were precisely memorized accounts, sometimes hours long, recounting genealogies and major events. The problem is that oral traditions don't survive societal collapse the way stone inscriptions do. When European colonizers arrived, they weren't interested in preserving what remained. They actively suppressed indigenous histories, claiming the continent had no history worth preserving. Consider Great Zimbabwe. In southeastern Africa stand massive stone walls, some 36 feet high, built without mortar from perfectly fitted granite blocks. At its peak around 1300 in the Common Era, this was the capital of a kingdom controlling the gold trade, home to perhaps 18,000 people. When European colonizers first encountered these ruins in the late 1800s, they refused to believe Africans had built them. They claimed the structures must be Phoenician, built by King Solomon's miners, constructed by Arab traders. Anything except admitting that indigenous African peoples had created a sophisticated stone-building civilization. This wasn't just racist dismissal. It was erasure. By denying local peoples could have built Great Zimbabwe, colonizers justified ignoring the oral histories that still existed. Instead of recording these accounts, colonial authorities actively suppressed them. The result? Even now, we still don't know crucial details about the civilization that created it. We don't know what they called their city. We don't know their rulers' titles or how their government functioned. We have only fragments of their story. The Kingdom of Kush tells a similar tale with added irony. For over 1,000 years, Kushite civilization thrived along the Nile in what's now Sudan. At times they conquered and ruled Egypt itself. They built pyramids in their own distinctive style. They developed their own writing system called Meroitic script. We found it on temples, tombs, everyday objects. But we can't read it. Despite decades of effort, Meroitic script remains largely undeciphered. We can identify a few words, but full texts remain opaque, locked away because when the Kushite kingdom fell, nobody survived who could teach the script's meaning. Think about what we've lost. Imagine if we couldn't read ancient Greek or Latin. All of Roman history a mystery. All of Greek philosophy lost. That's the situation with Kush. We have their monuments, their artifacts, their cities. We know they were sophisticated and powerful. But their own words remain silent. Recent decades have brought hope. Archaeological work across sub-Saharan Africa is revealing complex societies that colonial-era scholarship claimed didn't exist. Ancient cities are emerging from jungle vegetation. Genetic studies reveal unexpected migration patterns. Linguistic analysis shows cultural connections nobody suspected. The lost centuries of African history aren't necessarily lost forever. They're just harder to access, requiring more careful work, more respect for different forms of preservation, more willingness to challenge old assumptions. Every year brings new discoveries. The gaps are slowly being filled, not with speculation but with evidence and scholarship. Most importantly, African voices are reclaiming their own histories. The silences are being broken. Now let's venture into the Pacific, where one of humanity's greatest achievements remains shrouded in mystery. The Pacific Ocean covers nearly 64 million square miles, roughly one-third of Earth's entire surface. Scattered across this vast expanse are thousands of islands. By about 1200 in the Common Era, nearly every inhabitable island had been discovered, settled, and colonized by people traveling in wooden canoes. No compasses. No sextants. No GPS. Just outrigger canoes, knowledge of stars and currents, and extraordinary courage. This was the Polynesian expansion, one of the greatest feats of exploration in human history. And we have almost no idea how they actually did it. These weren't short coastal voyages. Polynesian navigators traveled thousands of miles across open ocean, locating islands sometimes less than 10 miles across, surrounded by hundreds or thousands of miles of empty water. The distance from Tahiti to Hawaii is about 2,600 miles. Tahiti to New Zealand, over 2,400 miles. Easter Island sits 1,200 miles from the nearest land. Yet all these places were found, settled, and connected by regular voyaging routes. We know some things. Polynesian navigators used sophisticated techniques called wayfinding. They memorized the positions of hundreds of stars. They read wave patterns, recognizing how swells bent around distant islands still below the horizon. They watched birds, knowing certain species only flew within specific ranges of land. They paid attention to clouds and tracked bioluminescent organisms. But here's the problem. By the time European explorers arrived in the Pacific in the 15 and 1600s, most of this knowledge was already being lost. The great age of Polynesian exploration had ended centuries earlier. The voyaging routes connecting islands across thousands of miles had been largely abandoned. What we know about traditional Polynesian navigation comes mostly from a handful of islands in Micronesia where traditions survived into the 20th century. But we don't know if what survived is the same as what was used during the Great Expansion 1,000 years earlier. And that's just navigation. The mysteries deepen when you look at specific islands. Take Easter Island, Rapa Nui. The usual story says Polynesian voyagers arrived around 1200 in the Common Era, found a pristine island covered in palm forests, flourished for a few centuries building famous statues, then destroyed their environment and collapsed into warfare. But recent research questions this narrative. The timeline of settlement keeps getting pushed back, possibly as early as 400 in the Common Era. That would mean Rapa Nui civilization lasted over 1,000 years before European contact, not just a few centuries. The environmental collapse story is also being questioned. Yes, the palm forest disappeared, but evidence suggests rats that arrived with Polynesian settlers ate the palm nuts, preventing regeneration. The ecology changed, but it didn't necessarily collapse catastrophically. And the warfare story comes almost entirely from European accounts written after European diseases had already devastated the island population. We're looking at a society in collapse and making assumptions about what came before. What was Rapa Nui society actually like at its height? We don't really know. We know they carved and moved hundreds of massive stone statues. We know they developed a unique writing system, one of only a handful independently invented in human history. But the details of their social structure, their economy, why they stopped making statues, all remain mysterious. Or consider Nan Madol in Micronesia. Most people have never heard of it, but it's one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the Pacific, perhaps the world. Nan Madol is a complex of 92 artificial islands built on a coral reef lagoon, constructed from massive basalt columns and coral fill, connected by canals. The whole complex covers over 200 acres. Some basalt columns weigh up to 50 tons. All of this was built without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals, on a remote island in the middle of the Pacific. Construction apparently began around 1200 and continued until about 1500 in the Common Era. But when European explorers encountered Nan Madol in the 1820s, it was already abandoned. Local people told them the city had been deserted for generations. The details of what happened, why it was abandoned, what life was like when it thrived, all of that was already lost to memory. These mysteries repeat across the Pacific. How did small island societies mobilize labor for massive construction projects? Where did engineering knowledge come from? What stories did these people tell that we'll never hear? And then there's the sweet potato mystery. The sweet potato is a South American plant that originated in the Andes. But when Europeans arrived in Polynesia, they found sweet potatoes already being grown across the Pacific from Hawaii to New Zealand. The Polynesian word for sweet potato, kamara, is remarkably similar to words for the plant in several South American languages. Recent DNA evidence confirms contact happened around 1200 in the Common Era. So somehow there was contact between Polynesia and South America before Europeans arrived. But we have no historical record of it. No archaeological evidence of settlements. Just the sweet potato, some linguistic similarities, and genetic traces. Did Polynesian voyagers reach South America and return? Did South American mariners venture west? We don't know. Both seem almost impossibly difficult, but we know one or both happened. This is what's so frustrating about Pacific history. We know extraordinary things happened. We can see evidence. But we don't know the details, the stories of the people involved. Much of what existed was oral tradition, and when Pacific populations collapsed following European contact, sometimes losing 90% of their people within a generation, that knowledge died with them. When you lose that many people that quickly, you lose the elders who remember old stories, the navigators who know traditional routes, the priests who understand religious traditions. You lose centuries of accumulated wisdom in a single generation. Pacific Islanders accomplished something that rivals anything in human history. They explored and settled the largest ocean on Earth using technology that represented the cutting edge of their time. They developed navigation techniques sophisticated enough to cross thousands of miles of open ocean reliably. And we barely know their story. That's the gap. That's what we've lost. Before we drift further into sleep, let's talk about Egypt, and a gap that exists right at the beginning of one of history's most famous civilizations. Picture yourself standing before the Great Pyramid of Giza. It's 2550 before the Common Era. You are watching thousands of workers moving massive limestone blocks with stunning precision. Engineers are calculating angles with remarkable accuracy. Scribes are recording everything in elegant hieroglyphics. But here's what should make you pause: this pyramid isn't the beginning of Egyptian civilization. It's not even close. By the time it was built, Egypt had already been a unified kingdom for over 400 years. Yet if you try to trace Egyptian civilization backward before the pyramids, before unification, you hit something strange. A transition so rapid it seems to violate everything we know about how civilizations develop. Around 3100 before the Common Era, Egypt suddenly appears as a fully formed complex society. Hieroglyphic writing emerges. Monumental architecture begins. Sophisticated religious systems appear. Centralized government coalesces under the first pharaohs. All of this happening almost overnight in historical terms. Before that, scattered agricultural villages. Simple pottery. Basic tools. The kind of Neolithic culture you'd find in dozens of places. Nothing that obviously leads to pyramids and hieroglyphics. It's like watching someone go from basic arithmetic to advanced calculus in a single semester. Something's missing. Hieroglyphic writing is the perfect example. The earliest systems we know about, like Sumerian cuneiform, you can trace developing over centuries. Simple pictographs becoming more abstract. Accounting marks evolving into phonetic symbols. Egyptian hieroglyphics don't work like that. The earliest examples are already sophisticated, using phonetic elements and complex combinations. It's not primitive writing figuring itself out. It's a mature system appearing almost fully formed around 3200 before the Common Era. If writing was developing earlier, where are the clumsy first attempts? The practice inscriptions, the experimental symbols, the inevitable mistakes. And if they borrowed the concept from Mesopotamia, why is Egyptian writing so completely different in form and structure? The architecture raises similar questions. The first pyramid appears around 2650 before the Common Era. It's not a rough first attempt. It's sophisticated, showing advanced engineering, mathematics, and stonework. But this appears less than 500 years after Egypt's unification. Before that, mostly mud brick buildings. The jump from mud brick to massive stone pyramids is enormous, not just in scale but in the entire knowledge base required. You need to know how to quarry stone in massive blocks. How to transport blocks weighing multiple tons. How to cut and fit them precisely. How to design structures that won't collapse. How to organize and feed the workforce. That's a lot of knowledge to develop in a few centuries, and archaeological evidence for the intermediate steps is surprisingly thin. Some researchers think there might have been an earlier sophisticated culture, something we call Dynasty Zero, that laid groundwork for everything that followed. We find shadowy figures and fragments of king lists and scattered artifacts. But the evidence is fragmentary. Then there's Nabta Playa. It's a dried lake bed in the Nubian desert, completely inhospitable today. But between 7000 and 3000 before the Common Era, when the Sahara was greener, Nabta Playa was an oasis. Around 5000 before the Common Era, possibly earlier, someone arranged large stone slabs in a circular pattern there. Not randomly, but aligned to astronomical events. The structure includes stone alignments that might have served as a primitive calendar. The people living in what's now the Sahara before it dried out completely weren't simple nomads. They were observing the sky, tracking celestial patterns, organizing communal labor for large construction projects. And here's the connection: around 3500 before the Common Era, when the Sahara underwent its final desiccation, turning from savanna to desert, these people had to move. The nearest place with reliable water was the Nile Valley. What if the sudden sophistication of late predynastic Egypt wasn't really sudden? What if it represents the arrival of people who'd been developing complex societies elsewhere, in regions now so arid that we've barely explored them? What if the skills that built pyramids, the knowledge that created hieroglyphics, the astronomical understanding that aligned monuments, what if all of that was developed in the Green Sahara by people whose settlements are now buried under sand? The climate evidence supports this. The final desiccation of the Sahara happened between 5000 and 3000 before the Common Era, with the most severe phase occurring right before dynastic Egypt emerged. Exactly when you'd expect large-scale migration. But if there was a sophisticated Saharan culture that migrated to Egypt, we're probably never going to find direct proof. The Sahara is enormous and hostile. Any settlements would be buried under centuries of sand, scattered by wind, destroyed by extreme temperatures. We might be looking at a gap that can never be completely filled. A lost chapter we know must exist because the story doesn't make sense without it, but which remains tantalizingly out of reach. What we're left with is this: Egyptian civilization didn't appear from nowhere. These things have to develop. Which means there must be a developmental period somewhere. We can see part of it in the archaeological record. But it's not enough. There are too many gaps, too many sudden jumps, too many skills appearing without the expected learning curve. Something else happened. Maybe migrations we can't trace. Maybe knowledge exchange we don't understand. Maybe lost traditions developed in places now impossible to excavate. When you stand before those pyramids, you're looking at the result of a process we don't fully understand. A transition from simple villages to complex civilization that happened faster than almost anywhere else. The predynastic gap remains one of archaeology's most fascinating mysteries. And somewhere, buried under Saharan sands or waiting in some unexplored corner, the missing pieces are still waiting. Now let's talk about the deepest gap of all. The one that sits at the very edge of recorded history, where we transition from the Ice Age into the world we recognize. Picture this: you're a member of a thriving hunter-gatherer community 12,900 years ago. Your people have been flourishing for millennia. The Ice Age is ending. Glaciers have been retreating for 7,000 years. Temperatures are warming. Life is getting easier. Your ancestors learned to hunt large animals, to process wild grains, to build permanent structures. Some settlements have hundreds of people. Trade networks stretch hundreds of miles. You're creating art, practicing astronomy, building monuments. You're on the verge of something. Maybe agriculture. Maybe cities. And then, in the span of a single human lifetime, everything collapses. It starts subtly. Colder winters. Shorter summers. But within a generation, something unprecedented happens. Global climate doesn't just cool, it collapses. Temperatures plummet back to full glacial conditions. Not over thousands of years, but over decades. Glaciers that have been retreating for 7 millennia suddenly surge forward. Forests die. Grasslands become tundra. The large animals you've hunted for generations start going extinct. Not just locally, but everywhere. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, cave bears, all disappearing within a few centuries. Your settlements become unsustainable. The food isn't there. The herds are gone. Wild grain fields have failed. People are starving. Some groups migrate. Others try to adapt. Many fail. The archaeological record shows dramatic population collapse. Cultures that flourished for thousands of years simply vanish. Their settlements abandoned. Their tool traditions discontinued. Their knowledge lost. This wasn't myth. This was the Younger Dryas, and it lasted 1,300 years. Before the Younger Dryas, during what archaeologists call the Alarod period, humans weren't just surviving. They were thriving. The Natufian culture of the Levant was building permanent stone structures 15,000 years ago. Not temporary camps, but year-round villages with mortared walls, plastered floors, storage facilities. They were harvesting wild grains so systematically they developed specialized tools. They'd achieved sedentary living through intensive foraging. In North America, the Clovis culture thrived. Sophisticated hunters with distinctive stone tool technology across the entire continent. They weren't random nomads. They were organized, capable of coordinating large-scale hunts. In Europe, Magdalenian hunter-gatherers were creating cave art so sophisticated it wouldn't be matched for 10,000 years. The paintings at Lascaux and Altamira aren't crude figures. They're dynamic, naturalistic depictions showing knowledge of perspective, motion, anatomy. The people creating this had leisure time, specialized artists, complex symbolic systems. They had culture in every meaningful sense. Then the Younger Dryas hit, and most of it disappeared. But some structures survived. And these structures are forcing us to completely rethink what we thought we knew. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. When discovered in the 1990s, it broke archaeology. The site is 11,600 years old, right at the end of the Younger Dryas, before agriculture, before pottery, before settled civilization as we understand it. But it's not a simple settlement. It's a monumental complex of massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing 20 tons, arranged in circular enclosures and covered with intricate carvings. Building this required coordinating hundreds of workers, quarrying limestone, moving massive blocks without wheels or draft animals, carving detailed reliefs with stone tools. This isn't what hunter-gatherers were supposed to be capable of. According to the old model, you need agriculture first, then surplus food, then specialized labor, then monuments. But Göbekli Tepe has it backwards. The monuments came first. The people who built it were still hunting and gathering. They hadn't invented agriculture yet. Or had they? Because Göbekli Tepe didn't appear from nowhere. The construction techniques, the symbolic systems, the social organization required, these things take time to develop. Generations, probably centuries. Which means there had to be predecessors. Earlier attempts. Simpler structures. A gradual evolution of skills and knowledge. But where are they? If they existed before the Younger Dryas, most evidence would be buried under 1,300 years of climate catastrophe. Sites abandoned. Structures collapsed. Organic materials decomposed. And that's just sites on land. Let's talk about sea levels. At the height of the last ice age, sea levels were 400 feet lower than today. The coastlines looked completely different. What's now underwater continental shelf was dry land. Millions of square miles of habitable territory. And here's the thing about coastlines, they're prime real estate. Rich in resources. Moderate climate. Easy to travel along. If advanced hunter-gatherer societies existed before the Younger Dryas, they would have been concentrated on coastlines. When the Ice Age ended, when sea levels rose those 400 feet over several thousand years, all those coastal settlements would have been inundated. Their structures flooded. Their artifacts scattered. Their evidence erased. We've lost an entire world beneath the waves. This raises an uncomfortable question: how advanced were these lost coastal cultures? The standard model says they were hunter-gatherers, complex perhaps, but fundamentally primitive. But what if they weren't? What if some groups had developed technologies we don't expect? These people had the same brain capacity we do. They'd been refining survival skills for hundreds of thousands of years. They had thousands of years of relative stability before the Younger Dryas. Why wouldn't they innovate? Some researchers point to anomalous structures worldwide. Massive blocks at certain sites. Precision stonework in others. Underwater structures off various coasts. Submerged ruins in unexpected places. Mainstream archaeology dismisses most as either natural formations or much younger than claimed. And they're probably right about most. But we know for certain that sophisticated hunter-gatherer societies existed. Göbekli Tepe proved it. We know vast territories were submerged. We know the Younger Dryas caused catastrophic population collapse. We know our ancestors were just as intelligent as we are. So how can we be absolutely sure there wasn't more? The extinction data supports something catastrophic. The Younger Dryas saw most Ice Age megafauna worldwide disappear. In North America alone, 35 genera of large mammals went extinct. Some of these species had survived multiple previous climate fluctuations over millions of years. But they couldn't survive this one. Neither could the Clovis culture. Their distinctive tool technology disappears from the archaeological record right at the Younger Dryas' beginning. The people didn't go extinct, but their culture did. Whatever social structure and knowledge system had allowed them to spread across a continent collapsed. This pattern repeats worldwide. Sophisticated cultures existing before 12,800 years ago. Then a gap. Then simpler cultures reappearing after the Younger Dryas ended 11,600 years ago. It's like a reset button was pushed on human cultural evolution. Not complete extinction, but severe enough disruption that accumulated knowledge and social complexity got lost. When civilization started rebuilding after the Younger Dryas, people had to relearn things their ancestors might have already figured out. And some knowledge might have been lost entirely. This represents humanity's largest historical blind spot. We have decent archaeological evidence going back about 10,000 years. Before that, the record gets increasingly fragmentary. And the Younger Dryas sits right at the breakpoint. Everything before it is harder to find, harder to interpret, more likely to have been destroyed. We're trying to understand human history with a 1,300-year catastrophe sitting right in the middle of the most interesting period. What did we lose? Maybe nothing more than hunter-gatherer camps and simple tools. Or maybe something more. Knowledge of astronomy developed over thousands of years. Mathematical systems sophisticated enough to predict seasons. Oral histories preserving information about migrations and environmental changes. Possibly even early forms of notation that didn't survive. We'll probably never know for certain. The evidence is buried under sediment, drowned beneath rising seas, destroyed by 1,300 years of climate catastrophe. But the gaps remain. And in those gaps, there's room for questions that make conventional wisdom uncomfortable. Our ancestors weren't primitive. They were smart, adaptive, capable of sophisticated achievements even without agriculture or cities. They survived the Younger Dryas, rebuilt their societies, and eventually created the civilizations we know. But what they created before, what they might have known and lost, that remains hidden in the largest gap in human history. The Younger Dryas ended 11,600 years ago. Glaciers retreated. Temperatures warmed. Within a few thousand years, the first true civilizations appeared: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley. But they didn't start from nothing. They built on knowledge and techniques that must have been developing for millennia. And some of that knowledge might have been very old indeed, preserved through catastrophe, passed down through generations, waiting for stable conditions to flourish again. We are all descendants of the survivors. Products of cultures that endured the worst climate disaster of the last 100,000 years. Inheritors of whatever they managed to preserve through the darkness. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the gaps, the dark spaces, the lost centuries that riddle human history. And you know what? We haven't solved anything. The Bronze Age collapse remains mysterious. We still don't know what happened to the Indus Valley people. The Dark Ages stay frustratingly dark. Pre-Columbian America keeps most secrets. Those Pacific voyages are still somewhere in the historical fog. But here's the thing about mysteries: they don't need solving to be valuable. There's something profoundly important about acknowledging what we don't know. Every gap in our understanding is an invitation, a reminder that history isn't a closed book. It's an ongoing investigation where every generation participates in discovery. Think about it. Every person who tells you they know exactly what happened in the past is filling gaps with assumptions. The honest approach is to say we don't know yet. And that yet is doing important work, because we're getting better at this constantly. Technologies that didn't exist 20 years ago are revolutionizing archaeology. Ground-penetrating radar mapping entire buried cities. DNA analysis tracking ancient migrations with precision. Satellite imagery revealing landscape modifications invisible from the ground. Each new tool illuminates another corner of darkness. Just recently, we've discovered entire civilizations nobody knew existed. Every single discovery requires rewriting textbooks, admitting what we thought we knew was incomplete. And that's going to keep happening. Someone listening right now might make the next big discovery. Not necessarily by finding some artifact in dramatic excavation. Maybe by asking a question nobody thought to ask. Maybe by applying new technology to an old problem. Maybe by looking at familiar evidence from an unfamiliar angle. The gaps aren't obstacles. They're opportunities. Every blank space is a chance for future researchers to make their mark. Every unsolved mystery is a puzzle waiting for someone patient enough, curious enough to piece it together. The lost epochs aren't lost forever. They're just lost for now. And there's something comforting about that. In a world that often feels completely mapped, totally explored, history reminds us that mystery still exists. That wonder is still possible. That we're still at the beginning of understanding our own story. We've been around for hundreds of thousands of years, and we've figured out tiny fragments of our past. The rest is waiting. So what should you take away? Maybe just this: certainty is overrated. The most interesting questions are ones we can't answer yet. Every generation stands on the shoulders of the previous one, seeing a little further into darkness. Your curiosity contributes to the collective effort to understand where we came from. Whether you're a professional archaeologist or just someone who finds this fascinating at 2 a.m, you're part of this ongoing investigation. If you've made it this far, leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from. Are you in the Americas, on land where lost civilizations thrived? In Europe, where dark ages cast their shadow? Somewhere in Africa, where so much deep history remains unwritten? Out in the Pacific, on islands reached by voyages whose details we've forgotten? Your location is part of the story too. Part of this ongoing human saga we're all trying to understand. Hit that like button if you enjoyed pondering these mysteries. Subscribe if you want to explore more of history's dark corners, because there are always more gaps to investigate, more lost epochs to illuminate, more shadows between known chapters. And if you're drifting off to sleep right now, let these mysteries follow you into dreams. Imagine those Bronze Age cities in their final moments. Picture Pacific navigators reading the stars. Wonder about the Indus Valley people going about daily lives in a civilization we're only beginning to understand. The past is still out there, waiting. And so is the future of discovery.